hypothesis of an exploded planet in recent years. His name is Dr. Tom Van Flandern.
Ah, indeed. Yeah, I remember him, yeah.
Right. He in his book, where he discusses this hypothesis of the exploding planet, actually will come out and say that the other alternative that should be considered is deliberate action. In other words, a war. Now, this to me is kind of where I take off, because the ancient texts that speak of this war are very clear that it is a war. In other words, it's not a catastrophe. It's not comets coming into the solar system and colliding with planets and so on and so forth. They talk about those things, to be sure, but they always talk of them in the context of a war fought by real people using really powerful and horrendous weapons.
Yeah.
And in my examination of the physics that I believe lies behind the Great Pyramid, which I outline in those 3 books, is that the only physics that I can discover that would be sufficiently powerful to blow up a planet like that is based on one of 2 things. It's either based on a scalar type of physics, or it's based on some weaponizable offshoot or versions, if you prefer, of a unified field theory of some sort. So we're dealing with a very powerful physics, and I stress again, it's a physics that would make a hydrogen bomb, that big colossal thing that the Russians set off in the early 1960s. It would make that look like a hydrogen, or make it look like a kitchen match.
Yeah, indeed. I'm looking at an article right here now from Tom Van Flandern on metaresearch.org, which is called the Exploded Planet Hypothesis 2000, and he has, laid forth this kind of formula where he measures the distances between the bodies in our solar system, and between Mars and Jupiter. Then there is a question mark, actually that according to the law of how the planets are equally divided, I guess, or spaced, as it were, in our solar system, there is a spot, missing between Mars and Jupiter. So, I mean, this is a very, very interesting, theory indeed.
Well, I get into that law. It's actually an ancient astronomical, not ancient, but an old astronomical law called the Titius-Bode law. It's 2 German astronomers. I get into that law in the second book, The Giza Death Star Deployed, and I explore it much further in the new book, The Cosmic War.
Interesting.
Basically, it's a law that predicts on the basis of a harmonic arithmetic progression of the distance of the orbits of planets from the Sun. And the astronomers at that time noticed that Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus all fell within the predictions made by this law, except that the law predicted precisely at the orbit of the asteroid belt the existence of a fairly large massed planet.
Indeed.
And this actually gave rise to the exploded planet hypothesis in the 19th century, the very early 19th century. And the astronomers even had a name for that planet, which I find is rather curious. They called it Krypton.
Ah, I see.
Yeah. So now, all the contemporary mythologies come a little closer to home.
Sure, absolutely. By the way, I have to ask you, have you heard about the work of Michael Tessarion? He discussed this basically exact idea in regards to that there was a second planet, or even in regards to how the planet was formed with full of water and so forth, that it actually was more like a second sun, basically. But he discussed this idea, and also ties in this that there actually was a warfare, or a war between the gods, as it were, that actually destroyed this planet. Oh
yes, I'm very familiar with his work. And basically my thinking is more or less the same as his. The thing that I add in the new book that's coming out, I mentioned it briefly in the last 2 Giza Death Star books as well, is that this missing planet, by all astronomical reckoning, would have been the same approximate mass as Saturn. But given the fact that the asteroid belt shows signs of having been fragments, or the debris field, as it were, of that planet, this was probably a solid planet, and it very likely was water-bearing. Now, in Van Flandern's speculation, the planet Mars may have actually been a satellite of this missing planet, and would account physics-wise for the eccentricity of Mars's orbit. And the other thing that an exploding planet, parent planet to Mars, would explain is the horrendously gouged and scarred nature of Mars's southern hemisphere, which geologists in the field will tell you has all the appearance of having been caused by sudden and massive flooding. So to put it somewhat differently, the best evidence for a planetary-wide conflagration and deluge of biblical proportions is actually on the planet Mars. So, that opens up the whole other can of worms, and it's a can of worms I explore in the last of the Giza Death Star book and in the new book, and that is the very strange associations that Mars has in human myth and lore with warfare, with rebellion, and so on and so forth. So, once we get into this scenario, we begin to see a lot of the connections beginning to make sense.
Indeed. I mean, it's a fascinating story. I mean, our ancient past and where we actually might have come from and what actually
right.
Yeah.
Well, the American researcher into the Martian anomalies, Richard Hoagland.
Sure, indeed, yeah.
He has said on many occasions, and I just love this quotation. He has said, we may find out, after all, that we are the Martians. And, that's a very succinct way of putting it.
Absolutely. And it's a bit, it's in some sense even more, thrilling, I guess, than actually, they're being Martians in that sense, in some way.
Right, because it raises the whole point of human origins again in another way. It doesn't so much question our ancient myths, the Sumerian myths or the biblical tales or so on, or the Hindu myths, but it does put them in an interpretive context that really, in a certain sense, shines a whole new light on all of these things.
Indeed, yeah.
So, this is the scenario that I spend a great deal of time with in the new book. And one more thing I should point out.
Yeah.
If we speculate for a moment that this missing exploded planet is of the same approximate mass as Saturn, and if we speculate that it had intelligent life, human-like life, in all likelihood that life would have been giant in stature. So I get into the question in the new book of the evidences and remains of giants on the Earth as being possibly one of the ways or evidences that would corroborate this whole scenario. So it's a fascinating scenario from any way one approaches it.
Indeed, yeah, very fascinating. Do you think that someone dismantled the pyramid as a weapon?
Oh yes, absolutely. One of the things that Sitchin in his book The Wars of Gods and Men gets into, and I reproduce extensively in the Giza Death Star his text and his arguments, and really dissect it even to much greater detail in the new book that's coming out by consulting some Babylonian myths that he does not mention in his books. There is clear case of an inventory being taken of the components of an akur, which is the Babylonian term for a ziggurat or a pyramid, after this war. And it's in a little Babylonian text called The Exploits of Ninurta. And if you read this text, your first impression is that, what kind of myth is this? Because the text is nothing. It goes on for page after page of inventories of the names of various power stones.
Okay.
And, the text is nothing but which stone gets saved and which stone is destroyed and which stone is turned into uses for other purposes. And it's interesting to me because it's exactly the type of thing that you would find done at the end of a hugely and horrendously destructive war by the victorious party. It's exactly the type of things that the Allies did to Germany at the end of World War II. You can develop this, but you can't develop that. We'll take this, you can have that. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
So the whole context of it rings true from purely a political and scientific standpoint. So the pyramid, if we couple this text, and I make the case for doing so in the new book, if we couple this text to the clear indicators in the structure of the pyramid itself that items are indeed missing, then what we have is a clear indicator that this weapon was deliberately dismantled and destroyed. I even suggest in the Giza Death Star, the first book, that the structure was left standing as a kind of a